Iron struck wood with a violence that shook the frost from the window panes, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the small, timber cabin. It was not the wind that forced the door open, but the heavy, mud-caked boot of a man who held a ledger in one hand and a lantern in the other. Clara stood before the hearth, her body shielding the small, shivering form of her 10-year-old son, Samuel. The fire behind her was dying, much like the hope she had desperately clung to since the mine collapsed and took her husband 3 months prior. Mr. Thorne did not step inside, he merely loomed in the doorframe, letting the brutal, sub-zero air rush past him to extinguish the little warmth remaining in the room. "Time is up, Clara," Thorne said, his voice flat and devoid of pity. "The company needs the cabin for the new foreman." "You have been given warnings." Clara looked at the man, her eyes hard and dry, refusing to give him the satisfaction of tears. "It is 20 degrees below zero, Mr. Thorne. To turn us out now is a death sentence." Thorne shrugged, a small, indifferent motion that shifted the snow on his heavy coat. "The company isn't a charity. You have 10 minutes to clear your things before my men come to strip the place." He turned his back, leaving the door wide open to the biting cold. Clara moved instantly, not wasting a second on pleading. "Samuel," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper, "get the blankets. All of them." And the heavy canvas sack. The boy moved with the stiffness of fear, his small hands fumbling with the wool. Clara packed only what they could carry on their backs: a cast-iron skillet, a bag of dried beans, a jar of lard, a small hatchet, and her husband's heavy coat. There were no wagons to take them away, no horses to bear the load. They were on foot in a world that had turned entirely white and hostile. As they stepped off the porch, the snow crunching loudly under their worn boots, Clara did not look back at the home where she had been a wife and a mother. She looked only at the endless grey horizon and the small, trembling hand she held in her own. "Where are we going, Mama?" Samuel asked, his teeth chattering so hard the words were barely intelligible. "Forward," Clara answered, tightening her grip until her knuckles were white. "We are going where the wind cannot find us." They walked into the blindness of the storm, 2 dark specks against an ocean of indifferent white, leaving the only life they knew behind them as the sun began to dip below the frozen mountains. The cold was not a passive thing, it was a predator that bit through layers of wool and leather, seeking the bone beneath. For hours, they trudged through drifts that reached Samuel's knees, the landscape rendered alien and featureless by the driving snow. Clara kept her body angled against the gusts, acting as a human shield for her son, but she could feel his pace slowing, his energy draining with every step. The town was miles behind them, a cluster of lights they could no longer see, and the open plain offered no mercy. There was no shelter here, only the skeletal remains of scrub brush and the howling expanse. Clara's mind raced, calculating the hours of daylight left against the failing strength in Samuel's legs. "Keep moving," she urged, her voice lost in the roar of the air. "Just to the ridge, Samuel." Just to the ridge. When they finally crested the rise, it was not a cave or a cabin they saw, but a jagged scar of metal half buried in a drift at the bottom of the ravine. It was a railcar, a massive iron beast that had derailed years ago, abandoned by the railroad company when the track was rerouted. It lay on its side, rusted and imposing, covered in a shroud of ice that made it look like a fallen monument to a forgotten age. To anyone else, it was wreckage. To Clara, it looked like a fortress. "Look," she shouted over the storm, pointing a gloved hand toward the ravine floor. Samuel squinted, his eyelashes frosted white. It's a train car," he stammered, his voice weak. "It's a house," Clara corrected him, infusing her tone with a certainty she did not fully feel. They slid down the embankment, the snow tumbling around them in miniature avalanches. The metal of the car was dark and formidable against the snow. It was a boxcar, its sliding door jammed halfway open, a gaping mouth swallowing the snow. Clara dropped her heavy pack and grabbed the edge of the iron door. "Pull with me," she commanded. Samuel grabbed the rusted metal, and together they strained, their boots slipping on the ice. It did not budge. The rust had fused it into place. Clara looked at the gap. It was just wide enough for them to squeeze through if they removed their heavy packs first. She shoved their belongings through the opening, hearing them thud onto the wooden floor inside. Inside. Now, she ordered. Samuel crawled through, vanishing into the dark belly of the iron whale. Clara followed, the sharp metal scraping her coat, and as she tumbled onto the floorboards, the wind scream was instantly muffled, replaced by the hollow, resonant silence of the steel chamber. Darkness inside the railcar was absolute until Clara fumbled for the lucifer matches in her pocket and lit the small lantern she had salvaged. The golden light flared, revealing a cavernous, industrial space that smelled of old grain, oxidizing iron, and time. The air here was still, but it was frigid, the metal walls radiating the cold from outside. It was a tomb of steel, but it was dry. "It's so cold, Mama," Samuel whispered, his breath pluming in the lantern light. Clara did not stop to comfort him with words, she comforted him with action. "Help me block the door," she said, her voice echoing in the empty space. They used the heavy canvas sack and an old tarp she had packed to curtain off the gap in the sliding door, weighing the fabric down with scrap metal debris scattered on the floor. It wasn't perfect, but it cut the draft. Clara then turned her attention to the floor. Years of debris, dried leaves, and old straw littered the corners. "We make a nest," she instructed. In the corner, away from the metal walls, they swept the center of the floor, piling the old, dry straw into a mound. Clara laid down the heavy wool blankets, creating a layered barrier against the freezing wood. She moved with a frenetic energy, knowing that if they stopped moving, the freeze would settle into their blood. She found a rusted bucket and positioned it near the door. "This is for the waste," she said plainly. "We do not go outside tonight." Not for anything. They sat together on the pile of blankets, huddling under her husband's heavy coat. Clara took the cast iron skillet and placed a small candle beneath it, a tiny, desperate attempt to radiate a fraction of heat. It was a trick she had learned from an old trapper, a way to warm hands over a small flame without wasting fuel. Samuel leaned his head against her shoulder, his shivering slowly subsiding into exhaustion. "Will Mr. Thorne find us here?" he asked, his voice small. Clara looked at the shadowed ribs of the railcar ceiling. "No," she said firmly. "He looks for people in houses, Samuel. He does not look for ghosts in a graveyard of iron. This is our place now." She ran a hand through his hair, feeling the grit and the cold. "Sleep now. Tomorrow we work." The days that followed were a blur of grey light and aching labor. The storm raged for 3 days, sealing them inside their iron lung. Survival became a rhythm of small, calculated movements. Clara rationed the dried beans and lard with the precision of a chemist, knowing their supplies were finite. The cold was a constant companion, a physical weight that pressed against the metal walls, trying to crush them. To keep the blood moving, Clara invented tasks. They scoured every inch of the railcar. In the back, crushed beneath a collapsed shelf, they found a treasure that made Clara weep with relief, a small, cast-iron pot-belly stove, likely being transported as freight when the train derailed. It was heavy, disconnected, and dusted with rust, but it was whole. "Can we light it?" Samuel asked, his eyes wide with the prospect of real heat. "We need a pipe," Clara said, scanning the ceiling. "And we need wood." The wood was the problem. The landscape outside was buried. But the railcar itself had wooden floorboards. Clara made a difficult choice. She used the hatchet to pry up the planks from the far end of the car, sacrificing a portion of their floor to save their lives. They jury-rigged a flue using a piece of rusted gutter pipe found in the debris, feeding it through a rusted-out hole in the roof, sealing the gaps with a mixture of mud and snow that froze into a concrete hard seal. When the first fire caught, burning the dry, aged oak of the floorboards, the railcar transformed. The metal walls, once ice-cold, began to hold the heat. The stove roared, a mechanical heart beating life into the space. But with the heat came the realization of their precariousness. Smoke rising from the ravine would be a signal fire to anyone watching from the ridge. "We only burn it at night," Clara told Samuel, her face illuminated by the orange glow of the grate. "During the day, we are cold. At night, we are hidden." It was a harsh rule. The daylight hours were spent shivering, huddled together, telling stories to distract from the hunger. Samuel asked about his father often. "He was strong," Clara would say, staring at the cold iron walls. He could build anything from nothing. And so can we. The isolation began to weigh on them. They were two specks in a white void, existing in a secret pocket of the world. Thorn and the town felt like a nightmare from another life, yet the fear of discovery was a sharp, jagged stone in Clara's gut. One morning, the sun broke through the storm clouds, casting a blinding, brilliant light over the snow. The temperature rose slightly, enough to melt the frost on the interior bolts of the car. Clara was scavenging in the deepest corner of the car, behind where the stove now sat, when she found the sacks. They were burlap, rotted and stiff, hidden beneath a collapse of timber. She sliced one open with her knife, expecting dust or rot. Instead, a stream of dark, rich soil spilled out onto the floorboards. It was potting soil, high quality and black as coal, likely destined for a wealthy estate before the train fell. And in the second sack, she found sealed tins. Seeds. Heirloom vegetables, flowers, sturdy roots. Samuel crawled over, watching the black dirt spill out. "It's dirt," he said, confused. "No," Clara whispered, plunging her hands into the soil, feeling the strange, soft warmth of it compared to the frozen ground outside. It's life. A wild, impossible idea took root in her mind, as stubborn as the weeds that grew in the mine tailings. They couldn't leave. They couldn't farm the frozen rock outside. But here, inside the belly of the iron beast, they had heat, they had light from the open door, and now, they had earth. "We are going to build a garden," Clara announced, her voice ringing with a sudden, fierce energy. Samuel looked at her as if she were mad. "Inside? In the winter?" Clara looked at the stove, then at the soil, then at the shaft of sunlight cutting through the door. "The world outside wants us dead, Samuel. It wants us cold and hungry. So we will make our own world in here." She grabbed the bucket. "We need to move this soil near the stove. We need to build boxes from the floorboards. We will plant the seeds." It was an act of defiance. To plant a seed in the dead of winter, in a wrecked train car, was to declare that they intended to survive not just the week, but the season. As they shoveled the dark earth, the smell of it, rich, loamy, and organic, filled the sterile metal space, masking the scent of rust. It was the smell of spring, trapped in a box, and for the first time since the eviction, Clara saw a spark of genuine excitement in Samuel's eyes. "What will we grow?" he asked, breathless. "Everything," Clara vowed. "We will grow everything." The transformation of the railcar began with the destruction of its own skeleton, a necessary sacrifice that Clara undertook with a grim, silent determination. To build a garden in the belly of an iron beast, she first had to tear out its ribs, prying up the thick oak floorboards from the unused end of the car with the edge of her hatchet. "Watch your eyes," she warned Samuel, as the dry wood splintered with a sharp crack that echoed like a pistol shot in the confined space. They worked for hours in the dim lantern light, their breath pluming in the cold air, dismantling the floor to create the frames that would hold their future. Clara was no carpenter, but desperation had given her hands a rough, intuitive skill. She used the rusted nails salvaged from the wood itself, hammering them straight against the iron wall before driving them back into the new configurations. They built 3 deep, rectangular troughs, positioning them in a semicircle around the pot-belly stove, close enough to steal its warmth but far enough to prevent the wood from scorching. "The heat rises," Clara explained, wiping sweat and soot from her forehead with the back of her glove. "We need to trap it here, near the soil." The soil itself was a heavy, frozen mass in the burlap sacks, and they had to break it apart with the hand trowel, warming small batches in the skillet before spreading it into the boxes. It was back-breaking work, the black dust coating their skin and filling their noses with the scent of deep, sleeping earth, a smell so alien in the sterile, metallic freeze of the winter that it made Samuel stop and inhale deeply. "It smells like rain," he whispered, his eyes closed. "It smells like survival," Clara corrected him gently. When the boxes were filled, the dark earth steaming slightly in the ambient heat of the stove, they opened the tins. Clara's fingers trembled as she handled the seeds, terrified of wasting even a single grain of potential life. "The carrots need the deep box," she instructed, handing Samuel the packet marked Danvers half long. "They need room to push down." The tomatoes go in the one closest to the heat, they love the sun, and the stove is our sun now. She saved the lettuce for the shallowest box, scattering the tiny, dust-like seeds across the surface with a delicate touch. They covered the seeds with a final dusting of soil and watered them with snow she had melted in the bucket, the water hissing softly as it hit the dry, thirsty earth. When they were finished, the railcar looked different. The industrial tomb now held 3 wooden cradles of black earth, a stark, organic promise against the rusting steel walls. Clara sat back on her heels, her muscles trembling with fatigue, looking at the silent boxes. "Now what?" Samuel asked, staring at the dirt. "Now," Clara said, pulling him close under the blanket, "we wait for the world to wake up." Time became measured not in hours but in the slow, silent unfurling of green life, a vigil that required a patience Clara did not know she possessed. The railcar became a closed ecosystem, a humid bubble of existence floating in a sea of ice. Condensation began to bead on the metal bolts of the ceiling, dripping down like clockwork tears, which Samuel caught in tin cups to return to the soil. For the first week, there was nothing but the black earth and the roar of the wind outside, a constant reminder of the death that waited just inches beyond the steel plating. Food was becoming a critical anxiety. The bag of dried beans was light in Clara's hand, and the lard was nearly gone. They ate once a day, a thin soup that warmed the belly but did not fill the hollow ache in their ribs. "Don't look at the food," Clara would say when she saw Samuel's eyes drift to the shelf. "Look at the garden." It was on the 9th day that the miracle happened. Samuel was kneeling by the shallow box, his face inches from the soil, when he gasped, "Mama! Look!" Clara rushed over, fearing a pest or a mold, but there, pushing through the crumbling black crust, were 2 tiny, vibrant green leaves. It was the lettuce. It was impossibly bright, a color that seemed to vibrate in the gray gloom of the car. Clara felt a sob catch in her throat, a sudden release of tension that nearly brought her to her knees. "It's growing," she whispered, touching the air above the sprout but daring not to touch the plant itself. "It knows we are here." Over the next few days, the carrot sent up feathery, delicate shoots, and the tomato plants emerged with thick, fuzzy stems that smelled faintly of summer musk. The psychological shift in the railcar was palpable. They were no longer just refugees hiding in a wreck, they were farmers tending a crop. The plants demanded a routine that anchored them. Samuel took charge of the sun, polishing a sheet of tin plating they had found to reflect the glow of the stove and the sliver of daylight from the door crack onto the leaves. He spoke to them, whispering encouragement to the tomatoes as if they were shy children. "Grow tall," he would say. "We made this warm for you." The green began to expand, breaking the monotony of rust and shadow, and with every new leaf, Clara felt the iron grip of despair loosen slightly, replaced by a fragile, terrifying hope that perhaps, against all logic, they would not just die here. The cold was a patient adversary, waiting for the fire to falter, and deep into the 2nd month, the crisis arrived not with a bang, but with the hollow scrape of the wood bin. They had burned through the loose debris and the sacrificed floorboards faster than Clara had anticipated, the sub-zero nights demanding a hungry fire to keep the frost from killing the tender tomato vines. Clara stared at the empty corner where the wood had been, then at the frost creeping up the bolts of the door. "I have to go out," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Samuel looked up from the garden, fear flashing in his eyes. "The storm is coming back," he said. "The plants will die if the fire goes out, Samuel. And so will we." She wrapped herself in every layer she owned, tying burlap sacks around her boots and pulling her husband's coat tight. She took the hatchet and the sled, a makeshift thing fashioned from a curved piece of sheet metal and rope. Stepping out of the railcar was like stepping into a physical blow. The air was solid with cold, instantly freezing the moisture in her nose. The landscape was a blinding white erasure, the familiar landmarks buried under drifts. Clara trudged toward the tree line, a dark smudge nearly a mile away. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the cold burning her lungs like smoke. She found a fallen pine, its branches shattered by the weight of the snow, and began to hack at the limbs. The sound of the hatchet was swallowed instantly by the vast silence. Her hands were numb, the vibrations of the impact jarring her bones, but she worked with a frantic rhythm, piling the green wood onto the sled. It wasn't enough to just survive, she needed enough fuel to cure the green wood near the stove. The return journey was a nightmare of endurance. The sled acted as an anchor, dragging through the deep powder, and the wind began to pick up, erasing her tracks seconds after she made them. She fell twice, the snow rushing into her collar, melting against her skin and sapping her heat. The second time, she lay there for a moment, the seductive drowsiness of hypothermia whispering to her to close her eyes. Then she thought of the tomato vines, the fragile green stems that would turn black and slimy within an hour of the fire dying. She screamed, a raw, animal sound of defiance, and forced her body to rise. When she finally shoved the wood through the railcar door and collapsed onto the floorboards, she was unable to speak, her body shaking so violently that Samuel had to strip the wet layers off her himself. He fed the fire, the green wood hissing and popping, sending a wave of life-saving heat back into the room. Clara watched the flames from the floor, her vision blurring, knowing they had bought perhaps another week of life. Green was a color that did not belong in the dead of winter, yet the interior of the railcar had become a lush, humid paradox. The tomato plants had grown tall, staked with rusted iron rods, their vines thick and heavy with the promise of fruit. The lettuce was a carpet of ruffled leaves, and the carrot tops were a dense, fern-like forest. The smell inside was no longer of old grain and rust, it smelled intensely of vegetation, a pungent, earthy aroma that hit you the moment you crossed the threshold. It was this smell that likely saved them, or perhaps condemned them. Clara was pruning the lower leaves of the tomato plants when the heavy thud of a horse's hoof struck the ground outside. She froze, her hand gripping the small knife. Samuel scrambled to the back, hiding behind the soil boxes. The door, which they kept cracked for ventilation during the day, was shoved open on its rusted track. A man stood there, silhouetted against the blinding snow. He wore the heavy canvas coat of a company scout, a rifle slung over his shoulder, his face obscured by a wool scarf. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the gloom, and then he stopped dead. He did not raise his rifle. He simply stared. He was expecting a corpse, or a starving drifter, or an empty shell. He was not expecting a greenhouse. The steam escaping the car curled around him, carrying the scent of tomato vines, a smell of high summer in the middle of a killing freeze. What in God's name? The man muttered, his voice rough with disuse. He stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Clara stood between him and the garden, the knife held low but visible. "This is not company property," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "This is wreckage. We claimed it." The scout looked at her, then passed her to the vibrant green leaves, the small yellow flowers on the tomato plants, the sheer impossibility of it. He reached out a gloved hand and touched a lettuce leaf, as if testing to see if it were a hallucination. He looked at the stove, the intricate system of tin reflectors, the water buckets. He looked at Samuel, who watched him with wide, terrified eyes. The scout lowered his hand. He could have evicted them. He could have dragged them back to town for trespassing. But the moral weight of the garden seemed to press on him. To destroy this act of stubborn, verdant creation in a world of ice, would be a sin greater than theft. He backed away slowly, his eyes lingering on the yellow flowers. "I didn't see anything here," he said, his voice quiet. "Just a rusted-out car filled with snow. No one lives here." He turned and stepped back into the cold, sliding the door shut behind him, leaving them in the warm, green silence of their secret world. The first harvest was a ceremony conducted in the dim light of the lantern, a holy moment that marked the end of their long siege. It was weeks after the scout had left, and the world outside was beginning to groan with the shifting sounds of the thaw. The icicles hanging from the railcar's roof were dripping, a rhythmic percussion that harmonized with the popping of the stove. Clara knelt by the deepest box and brushed away the soil from the base of the greens. "Ready?" she asked Samuel. He nodded, his face solemn. She gripped the green fern-like tops and pulled. The earth gave way with a soft tearing sound, and she lifted a bundle of carrots into the light. They were not the straight, uniform vegetables of the market, they were knobby, slightly twisted, and encrusted with black dirt, but to Clara, they were the most beautiful things she had ever seen. They washed them in the bucket, scrubbing away the soil to reveal the brilliant, shocking orange skin. Then, she moved to the tomato plants. The first fruit was small, the size of a fist, and imperfectly red, but it was ripe. She sliced it with her pocket knife, the juice running over her fingers, red as blood. She handed half the carrot and half the tomato to Samuel. "Eat," she said. Samuel took a bite of the carrot. The crunch was loud in the quiet car. He chewed slowly, his eyes widening. After months of dried beans, tasteless lard, and stale flour, the explosion of sweetness and earthy flavor was overwhelming. It tasted of the sun they hadn't seen, the minerals of the earth, and the sweat of their labor. It tasted of life. Samuel took a bite of the tomato, the acid and sugar making him wince with pleasure. "It's sweet," he said, juice running down his chin. "It's real." Clara ate her share, closing her eyes as the flavors hit her tongue. Tears finally leaked from her eyes, hot and fast, but they were not tears of grief. They had cheated the winter. They had taken a tomb and turned it into a womb. As the spring sun finally began to warm the metal roof, turning the railcar into a true oven, Clara opened the sliding door all the way. The snow was retreating, revealing patches of brown earth on the ravine floor. They stood in the doorway, healthy, fed, and alive, watching the world return to them. They were no longer the displaced widow and the orphan boy who had stumbled into the dark. They were the keepers of the garden, and they had grown roots strong enough to break iron.